I'm drinking coffee. I was late because I was making coffee. Everybody, take a deep breath. It is night 22. That means we only have 9 days left, which is unbelievable. It has been a busy, fruitful, productive, and interesting month. For those of you who are watching most nights, I really appreciate it. For those of you who are in and out for a variety of reasons, please be sure to take care of yourself, because doing something like this night after night, for myself, but for survivors, but for also people who are watching to learn more about Domestic Violence Awareness Month, it's a lot of trauma dumping. And trauma dumping is when you are basically enduring trauma by proxy or triggering your own trauma. And we all have trauma responses. We shut down, we cry, we eat more, we sleep more. There are a variety of coping skills that come with trauma. Some of it is migraines, shut the world out, anxiety, depression. It can all be triggered by trauma dumping. And trauma dumping can be, as I said, your own trauma. It could be your own trauma response from trauma from long ago. And it could also be trauma that you've really not heard before, or maybe even realized before that it was trauma. So I think it's important to realize that trauma comes in many forms. And we need to take care of ourselves. We need to always put ourselves first. As many people will say, the analogy is when you're on the plane and there's a problem, you should put the mask on yourself first, the oxygen mask on yourself first, before you attempt to save others. But for some of us, that is not our instinct. And so I just want to be sure that you are taking care of yourself. One of the things that is in this month's subscription box, I'm going to go ahead and share it with you because I think it's important. So I'm going to go ahead and flip the camera. All right, so I have flipped the camera. So I want to show you an item that is in this month's subscription box because I think it's important to think about as we are listening to these events each night. So here's one of them. The box is focused on healing your inner child. And so I put a school bus, and on the inside are permission slips. So I give myself permission to set limits and say no. I give myself permission to stop and take a break. I give myself permission to listen to what I need. I give myself permission to not be perfect. I give myself permission to be present. And I give myself permission to accept help from others. All of these are extremely difficult permissions um, that we don't always do. We don't always practice those things. So, um, all right. So I am going to start the podcast. So you are listening to Love Over Coffee, and this is a platform and a podcast for the marginalized, the silenced, and the abused. I'm going to do the countdown. Can you hear us now? Can you hear now, Shirley? We're having some tech issues. And I'll share the permissions again at the end. Great. Okay. So let me. Okay, good. All right. I may not have had the sound on, ladies. I'm multitasking. All right. So here we go. Here's the countdown. So this is an interview I did with a friend of mine named Donna Pollard. She lives in Louisville, and she is going to talk a little bit about who she is, where she's been, and where she's going. And there's a lot of great, valuable information in this particular podcast. So here we go. Okay, I've got some people saying that they can't hear. So let's try again. How is the sound on TikTok? Are we hearing something on TikTok? Okay. Let's go here. Hmm. Okay. Let's try again. We'll start after this goes.
Yeah. You got to have that countdown.
It's so official now, right?
Exactly.
So, welcome everyone to Love Over Coffee, Voices Not Heard. This is a platform and a podcast for the marginalized, the silenced, and the abused. And I am happy to say that today is actually 2 years since we launched. Um, Today is World Narcissistic Abuse Awareness Day, of which I am a survivor. And I want to give voice to all individuals whose lived experiences have perhaps not been like your own, and have included abuse of some form. So, we are going to talk about narcissistic abuse in particular today, but I am sure that we will touch on other types of abuse as well. My first guest is someone who is special to me because she gave me an opportunity to own my trauma and share it when it was safe or comfortable for me to do so. And that empowerment has been crucial to where I am today because until then, I think I was trauma dumping on everyone, but not really. It was almost like I was still disconnected from the abuse. But when I could really put it in place and realize that my life now had endured trauma and that it was a part of who I am now, but it does not have to define me, was a turning point. So tonight's guest is Donna Pollard. She is from Louisville, Kentucky, and I'm going to ask you the infamous question. Tell us who you are, where you've been, and where you're going. And we'll probably save the where you're going more toward the end. But I want to give the people who are watching a chance to kind of know a little bit about you. She has been a guest before. In fact, she was one of the first guests 2 years ago. So here we go.
Thank you so much, Tina. It's really an honor to be with you today and to be able to see you again. I know it's definitely been some time. And also just to be able to reach an audience that, this is something I think that really resonates with a lot of people on the topic of narcissistic abuse, domestic violence. There's so much trauma, unfortunately, that occurs in our society. And I think that all of our stories definitely are relatable to someone out there, or at least people that we know. So, as Tina mentioned, my name is Donna Pollard, and I identify as a survivor of sexual exploitation and child marriage. To ask where I've been is a kind of a loaded question, right? Because
Like, where haven't I been, right?
right, exactly. My story has been a series of stories that have been rooted in a lot of very traumatic events that I really didn't begin to start reconciling until about 7 years ago, back in 2016. And at that point, I was in my early 30s. I was finally leaving a very toxic relationship with, the person that I had been with off and on for 13 years. And, really had a lot of inner reflection that I had to do. And during that time, I was able to trace back that so much of the pain that I carried, so much of the self loathing that was very prominent in my life could all be traced back to that sequence of events that I mentioned. It really began when I was a child. I grew up with a mother who definitely had very narcissistic tendencies. She was very abusive physically and emotionally. And she also, made it very clear, from as early as I can remember, that I was not wanted. I hadn't been planned. I was not wanted. And so, between all of the abuse and then those very consistent messages, I internalized so much of that. And it turned into that sense of self loathing. And that really paved the way for me to make decisions that were rooted in that trauma and rooted in that narrative that I was not worthy and that I was not lovable and that, I was destined to be abandoned. I was destined to, be mistreated. And so many of my early life decisions were seeking out that repetition.
Right.
Learned a term in therapy just a few months ago that really made things click for me, and that is repetition compulsion, where we are placing ourselves in positions. It's almost like we're watching ourselves in a movie and we can't stop ourselves because there is this unconscious drive to repeat the patterns that we experienced early on and try and try and try to achieve a different outcome. And once I learned that, that light bulb went off. And I realized that's the reason that I had been in so many toxic situations. That's the reason that, I found this very strange comfort in being in abusive
Right.
situations. It was
For,
familiar.
for me, I think of it as if you are leading with your trauma, you're
Hmm.
being led to the wrong places. But the trauma is so comfortable
Right,
because it's all you've ever known, and
right.
it is what you have come to believe. So not only has it been where you've been, but it
Mhm.
becomes a part of who you are instead
Mhm.
of being something that happened 6 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. It becomes a part of your response mechanism.
Right.
That creates, I can see, repetition compulsion. That makes perfect sense.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right, Tina. It isn't just an event or even a series of events. It becomes a fabric of our own identity. It becomes the cloak in which we wear that we show up in day to day in the world. And it may not be how we present ourselves. One of the things that I found for myself was that I had to present myself as the most put together individual that I possibly could. I
Right.
had to make sure that I was always very articulate and I had to make sure that I was excelling in my job and I was chasing promotions and I was getting great accolades. And, I had to graduate summa cum laude once I was able to put myself through college and, all of these things that
Overachieving.
absolutely, absolutely, because I wanted to create this identity for myself that was the polar opposite of what
Hmm.
I was raised to believe that I was. And I don't think that that in and of itself is necessarily an unhealthy response, but the unhealthy part of it for me personally was that my inner dialogue did not change with those achievements. My
I was
inner
going to
dialogue,
say, you're pushing and pushing and
yeah,
pushing, but yet the inner dialogue is still saying, I'm not enough. I have to do more. And the more
exactly.
you do, the more you're still pushing for that. What's next? What's next? What's next?
Yeah.
You never learn to have joy for a moment.
Yeah, exactly. Or peace, or even peace, because we don't really know what authentic peace is
Right.
when we're in that position.
Hmm.
So, the early trauma that I experienced, just kind of going back to, where I've been, the early trauma that I experienced with my mom really paved the way for me to be in an extremely exploitive situation when I was 14, with everything that I experienced with her, my father passing away of advanced lung cancer when I was 13 years old, so many things that had happened. I started acting out as a teenager. I mean, teenagers in the best of situations act out, right? Their frontal lobe is developing, and that
Right.
doesn't happen until they're 25. So, there's definitely a lot of complexity at that age anyway, and then couple that with some really toxic situations. And my behavior was such that I ended up being admitted to a behavioral health facility when I was 14. And unfortunately, instead of receiving the help and support that I needed there, I was preyed upon by a mental health technician that worked there. He knew my history. He groomed me. He was 29 years old. And my mother, again, being very narcissistic and also, not wanting me to begin with, saw it as an open door to be able to offload the responsibility of me finally. So she let me date him. Again, he was 29, I was 14. When I was released from the facility, she let me date him. She would go so far as to drive up from London, Kentucky, where we were living at the time, to E Town, and he would drive down from Jeffersonville, Indiana, and she would drop me off with him at motels. I mean, there was just so much toxic stuff that happened, but I clung to him because he was the one person in my life at that time that had shown me any attention and had shown me affection. And what I didn't realize was that that is part of the grooming process. He was a predator that had positioned himself in a facility that was filled with vulnerable people that he could
How
prey.
convenient for a predator.
Absolutely,
They
exactly.
know what they're doing.
Absolutely. And I was such an easy target because, for one thing, I was looking for a source of unconditional love. And then for the other, my mother just handed me over to him on a silver platter. And, flash forward a couple of years of, the dating, and I use that term in quotes,
Right.
and she married me off to him when I was 16 years old. And, I ended up being forced to drop out of high school. I didn't even complete the 10th grade, and, it's so ironic that I'm sharing this with you today because my daughter, who will actually be 16 on the 22nd of this month, she just finished her sophomore year, and it has been in my head the entire day. She made it. And I'm sorry, I'm going to get emotional
No, I was
for
going to
this, but
say that has to be hard because she's having the experiences that you missed out on. It
oh,
has
yeah,
to be, even though it's a proud moment for you as her mom, it
yeah,
has to also be a bit of a trigger. That's
it
hard.
is. It is. It truly is. And I don't want, to sound like I'm trying to take anything away from her accomplishments because she is amazing. And she's going to continue going on to finish high school. I mean, goodness, she's already got some, entry level college courses under her belt, too.
Wow.
I mean, the girl is amazing. She's so driven. And I cannot wait to see what she ends up achieving in life.
Right.
You're absolutely right. It is also a trigger for me. Her going to prom, she went to prom this year. She was invited by a junior, and her having that experience was a trigger. I was so happy for her. And I also couldn't help but reflect on what I didn't get to have. And I think that that's another thing that's really important to give consideration to for trauma survivors as well, is that it's natural to experience these triggers, and it's
Right.
okay for us to allow ourselves to have that emotion and to mourn what we never had, and it not be considered selfish, and it not be considered from deflecting from the joy that our children do get to experience,
Mhm.
because we are.
I'm going to stop for just a moment. I had a friend reach out to me today on Facebook Messenger and said that she was experiencing just a deep sadness. And sadness is a part of the process of healing because you have to grieve what you thought was but wasn't, what you think should be but isn't, and you're grieving what you thought would be but it will never be. Think about the individuals whose abuser passes away. There's never any closure. So, sometimes when our abuser is perhaps our parents or a sibling or someone close to us in the family, even though they are an abuser, they are sometimes loved by others in a way that doesn't make sense to us. But when they pass on, there is a sadness that you'll never get an explanation, you'll never get an understanding. There is no closure sometimes for a victim and or a survivor, because if you don't choose to have those conversations for whatever reason, then you have to move on from that. And moving on from that can be an extremely difficult process because the opportunity has come and gone.
Complex individuals,
We are, and I know even for me, I mean, it's been 5 years, and there are still moments where something will remind me of something else,
Yeah.
and it gives me a chance to kind of reprocess or analyze it in a different way from a different perspective, whereas it was such an acute trauma at the time, and now there's so much distance between it that it's like, that makes sense now. um, because as I said, we lead with our trauma, but it becomes such the norm.
Right. It does. It absolutely does. And we normalize behaviors that are not healthy, right? Like that becomes our norm, that becomes our go to. And, even in the way that we treat ourselves, right? And what has been really interesting for me to reflect on, especially as my daughter has started to get to that age where she's gaining independence, she works a couple jobs on top of going to school and all that. And I have this incongruency between still feeling like, on some levels, even though I have come so far,
Right.
I still feel in some levels that I'm not enough. I didn't do enough. I wasn't a good enough mother. I didn't provide enough because,
Right.
up until the past decade, the struggle financially was
Mm.
very, very real. And yet also at the same time, seeing everything that, she has done and feeling like I did give her a good level of support. I gave her the support that she needed. And again, not taking away from her own achievements, those are certainly hers to own and to celebrate. But, you know, children are not able to thrive at those levels without some type of foundational support.
Right.
So,
You got to take some credit.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'll give myself credit for making sure that she got to live a life that was opposite of what I grew up with.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And now, of course, again, that's not to say there haven't been struggles. I definitely have not done things perfectly. But I will own that. I will own
There is
that I
someone who just made a comment that says, I am beyond blessed to work for this amazing woman. Daily positivity and reminders keep me on the right path of leaving my narcissistic abuse ex husband. Thank you, Donna, for being my role model and pushing everyone around you to be their best. We wouldn't be here without you. And that is someone, Morgan Davis.
oh my gosh, Morgan.
She says, don't make me cry, but okay.
Oh, the tears.
Yeah.
I'm glad you all can't see me on camera right now.
Well, they might be able to if they're
wow.
on my personal page or the Real Change page. Yeah, or they'll see it later.
Right, exactly. Oh goodness. Yeah, I really appreciate that. I truly think that, part of the healing journey is finding that connectivity with people and being able to be open in ways that feel safe to us, of relating our stories and relating our experiences, because there isn't, I mean, I hear a lot from people of, oh, well, I didn't have it as bad as you, or I didn't have it as bad as somebody else.
Mhm.
There's no comparison when it comes to trauma.
No, trauma's
They're
relative,
just
isn't it?
exactly, and they're just different expressions of a very similar feeling. And so the experiences themselves, there is no measurement between them. It's just a matter of how you respond to it and being able to,
Mm.
have that connectivity with another person where you can look another person in the eye and say, I get it. I
Well,
see
I'm
you.
watching, Karen. Karen is someone who was involved in a 38-year relationship with someone who was narcissistic, and my relationship was 39 months. And
Yeah.
I think to myself, thank God it was only 39 months, but our responses have
Hmm.
taken just as much time. And it's
Right.
like, how is that possible? 39 months versus almost 40 years. And it's like, how can I even compare? Plus, I know her situation did include some physical altercations, and mine did not. And it's
Right.
like, how can I even say you almost feel like a little bit of that imposter syndrome, like
Oh,
my
yes.
abuse wasn't as bad as your abuse. So I
Yeah.
really have nothing to complain about or nothing to share. And
Hmm.
yet, as I pointed out in the beginning, when I first met you, one of the things is the trauma that brought you to where you are at that moment is probably layered trauma that you didn't yet uncover, because
Hmm.
I've always been a kid who sought attention. So
Right.
like you, when the narcissist came with all the attention, it
Yeah.
seemed so grand and wonderful. It was
Right.
easy for him to groom me because I was right for the picking, so to speak.
Right.
um, and that's a hard thing. It took me a long time to own that, because it meant somehow that it's like I found him as much as he found me.
Hmm.
And and me finding him sounds like a little bit of that line of victim blaming. And that victim blaming really makes me crazy. But at the same time, when you think about your trauma
Hmm.
in connection or relationship to another person's trauma, it
Right.
makes sense why you're drawn to each other. Doesn't make it right.
Absolutely.
It certainly doesn't make it easy. It doesn't make it comfortable or
Right.
normal. But again, in our society, we've normalized, well, you guys are in a new relationship. This is all normal for it to be hard or this or that.
Hmm.
And really, it isn't. It shouldn't be. It shouldn't
Right.
be.
Exactly. Exactly. And, going back to what you had said about, being right for the picking and, how, to say that you sought him out too, it does definitely, I can totally see where you're coming from about the victim blaming feel to it. I think that it's so common for people that have experienced early life trauma and early life exposure to narcissistic abuse to end up finding themselves in those cycles. And
Mhm.
then the other part of that too is that, when we're exposed to a narcissist, the mind games are so real. And, going back to that experience that, I had where I was married off at 16, after a couple of years of him grooming me, I mean, I would have done anything in the world for him. And he ended up, exploiting me through a strip club. And so, whereas of course it didn't feel good that that was happening, there was so much that was happening at that time that did not feel good. Then I had the added layer of the shame from what I did,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? And so being able to get to a place where we can reflect on the things that happened to us or even the choices that we made in response to those things and exercise self forgiveness, even if there's, even if it was not our fault, being able to call in that self love, that self
Mhm.
forgiveness, and say, I can own my worth beyond this. Because as you said very early on in this podcast, Tina, we are not defined by
No.
what happened to us. We're also not defined by the choices that we made when we were in survival mode. I think, a lot of our self identity gets rooted based on how other people perceive us.
Well, just like we
Instead,
get it rooted in our accomplishments. For
yeah.
me, I can remember making a very conscious connection
Hmm.
between my sister losing weight and me being sexually abused at
Hmm.
around the same time, and
Hmm.
realizing that I didn't want to be known or used or abused for my body, even though I may not have had those words. But
Right.
I saw my sister doing a lot of things for attention
Hmm.
that would get male attention, losing weight and all of that. And I was the complete opposite and being sexually abused and making that conscious connection that I would be known for my achievements
Right.
and my accomplishments rather than my body. So my accomplishments are something I've always worked hard to achieve and worked hard to accomplish, and those are the very things that still got abused. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the thing. It doesn't matter. Abuse comes at the hands of the abuser,
Right.
not at the hands of the person who is trying to please.
Right.
Wrong. It perhaps is a negative place that you have found yourself in, wanting to please or be the people pleaser or be the quiet one, but it still does not explain. Rather than why why didn't you leave, it should be why did you abuse,
Right.
because
Exactly.
that's where it rests. But
Hmm.
we often we don't even have the terminology to take it in and let it sit there and let it come back out, because we're so busy trying to cover up
Hmm.
what seems shameful or blame
Right.
or negative. And I know it took me years and years and years to be able to say, I will never own the abuse, but
Hmm.
I'll own my healing. And
Right.
my healing means I have to own the trauma.
Right.
Good or bad, right or wrong, real or imagined, what has happened to me, I have to own that. And I
Right.
have to process and analyze and leave it somewhere,
Hmm.
compartmentalize it somewhere, um,
Hmm.
because otherwise you'll keep leading with it. But
Yeah.
I think it's so hard. It's so hard to find that line. Um,
Hmm.
I don't
And I
know.
think it's also about, identifying, like, especially in the healing journey. I think a lot of times when people start on that healing journey and they start exercising mindfulness of, their own responses to day life, that may trigger insecurities. It may trigger those inner voices that, are telling us we're not enough, we'll never be good enough, all of that. It's really important to reflect on whose voice is that really,
Right.
whose voice is actually coming forward at that time.
Mhm.
And again, I absolutely believe that you can utilize some of that in a healthy manner to, be that driving force behind the achievements, as long as we are also exercising boundaries with that. And I'll
Right.
be very transparent, as you're talking about the achievements and such, Tina, when you met me, I was very heavily involved in advocacy work. I was running the nonprofit and I was pouring myself into those realms where I was highly visible with my story on a global level. I was very involved in the political aspect of it, changing laws in multiple states and child marriage. And I don't regret any of that. And, I eventually would like to go back into the realm of advocacy to a smaller scale. And the reason that I say that is because it was like I had become addicted. I became addicted to the validation that I was not defined by the experiences that I'd been through. I
Right.
said yes to every media interview. I mean, including having reporters coming in from other countries, me going to another country, I mean, like all of these different very large scale things became this edification for me, this external validation that what I went through had a purpose.
And it's
Yeah.
easy to, I think it's easy to hide
Hmm.
behind
Hmm.
staying busy
Oh, yes.
and not doing the work because you know,
Yeah. And
that's a
it felt like
part
on the
of it.
surface, right? Because it felt like on the surface for me, like, oh,
You're
well,
doing a
look what I'm
lot.
doing. Yeah, look at all that I'm doing, right? I mean, yeah. So it felt like, yeah, I'm doing all this work. And I was to a very large degree, but the inner work, the actual
Right.
work of self acceptance, that was not present.
Yeah,
That's the
you weren't
reason.
healing Donna. You were
Yeah,
healing the world.
exactly.
I mean, because sometimes I'm gonna be transparent for a moment. This podcast grew out of the same thing. Okay,
Yeah,
that's that same desire to be the change you want to see in the world.
right.
And for a long time, it felt like I'll show him.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, now it has become an entity of its own and grown on its own beyond those initial stages of I'll show you.
Right.
Because one of the things that he was so involved with,
Mm-hmm.
aside from his extracurricular activities, were having a radio show and doing those kinds of things that I was supposed to be a part of. But
Right.
because he was using what he was doing to entice other people into the game, I never had a chance to do that. And
Right.
so initially it was like, do I really want to do this? Or am I just doing this because he's like out there somewhere? But now I realize that this is really where I was meant to be, which
Yeah.
is another element of probably what drew me to him in the
Right.
sense that I didn't trust I could really do it. And here I
Mhm.
am. 2 years later, I'm still doing it. And at the time though, it was like I can't do it. I don't know how. I
Yeah.
need someone. And I
Mhm.
really didn't. But it
Yeah.
takes a long time to figure all that out.
Yeah, it does. It truly does. And, I don't think that there's anything wrong with us reflecting, not questioning, but reflecting on what our own
Right.
motives are in showing up in the spaces that we do, right? Because, especially those of us that are involved in advocacy and, some capacity or, very public with our experiences, as you and I
Hmm.
both have been, there is a lot of drive that can very well come from that need for that external validation.
Right.
And again, that's not to say there's anything wrong with that, because that's certainly part of the healing journey. But when that's not present, what are we left with? And as you said,
Mhm.
and for me personally, during that period of years, I was absolutely focused on healing the world because that became my purpose.
Mhm.
I thought that
Yes.
it was my sole mission in life to protect other girls and women from going through what I had. And I felt that if I could finally find the confidence within myself to vocalize what had happened to me early on in life,
Right.
then I could transform their lives before they went down that deep, dark path that I had to walk through for so long.
Hmm.
And, not only that, but it also gave me that purpose, because growing up as a child that felt very unlovable and unworthy, I didn't feel that I had a purpose in life beyond, what I could bring to other people, going back to the people pleasing comment that you had
Right.
mentioned.
Right.
And so, getting to the point where I felt like I was bringing something to the world, I was adding contributions to the world, felt so gratifying until
Hmm.
it wasn't enough.
And
Because,
I know for me, it was like I can sit here and say I am someone who loves attention.
mm,
Um, but do I love it because I crave it? Or do I love it because I deserve it? You know, my love language has always been quality time and words of affirmation. I mean, those are two things that validate the very core of who I am.
mm,
And I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg. I don't
yeah,
know whether those things came first before the trauma or those were initial trauma responses, but I've always been a lover of words and
Mm-hmm.
telling others how important they are.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, sometimes we give out what we want back.
Right. Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
see
We
that in
absolutely.
myself. And that's not a negative thing. It's not a negative to want attention. It's negative to manipulate people to get attention.
Right.
And
Exactly.
that's where we have to separate ourselves again from the
Mhm.
trauma response, and from some of the individuals that we have allowed to walk with us.
Right, exactly, exactly. And, also really asking ourselves at the end of the day after we've put ourselves out there, how does this feel? How
Hmm.
does it actually feel, in our mind space? Like, what is our inner dialogue starting to spark up now, right? How
Right.
does it feel in our bodies? And being able to answer that honestly without judgment of ourselves, too.
Right.
I think I've been very, very fortunate that
Hi, Amy.
I have found safe spaces
Mhm.
along the way to be able to share, my experiences and such. And, fortunately now also I have a wonderful partner that I can trust. Quite honestly, the very first truly healthy relationship that I've ever been in. And being able to see that contrast has been really eye opening to me as well, and honestly also really opened my eyes to all of that woundedness that I did continue to carry. Because now all of a sudden you have this contrast where you're in a situation where, you don't have somebody that's manipulating you. I mean, I could read people like a book. I
Oh
knew what
yeah.
was coming. I was hip to the games. I didn't play games myself, but I would play other people's games. I allowed myself to be in those situations before. And again, that goes back to that feeling of not being worthy. And
It's
then you
one of
find
those
yourself
things where
in,
it's like, oh, you think you're smart?
yeah,
Just
yeah,
sit
I'm gonna
back
play
and
this out.
hold your,
Right.
hold
Yeah,
your trousers, because I'll show you how smart I am.
exactly. Yeah. And it's like, okay, we can play this out. We can play this out. You think you got me. We can play this
Right,
out.
right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then, being in a situation where it's the polar opposite of that, and, you know, someone shows up just truly in authentic love, authentic support. And at first, that's like, wait, no, this
When's the
isn't
other shoe gonna drop?
exactly. When is that other shoe going to drop? Right. Exactly. Exactly. But, I think it's a reinforcement of the healing too, because I also think that our healing deepens when we have what we need reflected by other people to us, right?
Mhm.
So if we're able to have those conversations in safe spaces and, acknowledge that I'm feeling this way, I'm feeling very insecure, this situation happened, it triggered this emotion with me. And when the conversation goes deep and the validation is reflected back to you, not as an external source, but as the depth of your own internal resources, right? The depth of your own internal strength,
Mhm.
that is when that healing really starts to integrate and we embody the healing. That's what was missing all those years during the advocacy work. I wasn't embodying the healing.
Well, you were pouring your cup very easily,
Yeah,
but your own cup was never full.
absolutely.
I
Absolutely.
mean, again, when you lead with trauma,
Yeah.
whether you know it or not,
Hmm.
um, you are constantly seeking out opportunities that sure allow you to help another. But
Right.
until you've really healed what's inside, it's
Hmm.
all superficial. Because
Yeah.
I know for me, I found a community at Survivor's Corner, and I also found a community on Clubhouse. But I also realize now that I've outgrown both of those spaces, and that's not a bad thing. I outgrew my need for Survivor's Corner, and I've outgrown. Are you still there, Donna? Did
Yes,
you,
I'm here.
oh,
You cut out for a minute, but you're back now.
so, you realize that as much as you were drawn into those spaces and you found community, which was not a negative thing because it
Right.
allowed you to grow,
Right.
But at the same time, you realize that at some point you move beyond that level,
Hmm.
because I know for me, Clubhouse was a daily thing, hours and hours and hours, and YouTube videos and videos and videos. And now I am beyond that. I want to share those things with other people,
Right.
but my own need for them, I've outgrown. My healing has now outgrown my own need for those things.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that Clubhouse videos or anything like that is negative, but
Hmm.
at some point, your own healing moves beyond your trauma, and that's exactly what's supposed to happen.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
You know?
Exactly. Exactly. And, also, I always go back to the saying that healing is not a destination, right?
Yes.
It's not a linear process. It is truly a
I
journey.
still say that pisses me off to find out that healing's not linear.
Sorry, Tina. I always told you I'll shoot straight with you.
It's definitely this. It's like I get
Yeah.
over here and then I go right back over there, and it's like, but
Yeah.
I thought I was over here.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things that a therapist once shared with me that really stuck with me too is that it's not about getting to this place where you're no longer having emotional responses to, memories of traumatic events or even continued traumatic events that may happen in our lives, because we never know what life is going to have in store for us. It's really, a deepening of healing is really a matter of having a bigger container within ourselves to be able to process through those emotions, to really be able to authentically experience them and know that it's not a permanent state. That emotion
Right.
that's arising is not a permanent state. We can experience it. We can, find those safe spaces where we can express what we need in response to it. And then we can, heal that wound just a little bit deeper as we continue to move on and tackle, all the things that come up in life for us. And I think that's really, that is the space that I've landed in now, as we transition into where I'm
Right.
now, right? What am I doing now?
Well, and I was going to say, one of the things that you mentioned that you wanted to talk a little bit about was, I guess, narcissistic abuse or abuse in particular, and a little bit about attachment styles.
Hmm.
So, what can you tell us about that connection? Is that
Yeah. That's a really great question. So, going back to the experience that I had with my mom, and her having very narcissistic tendencies, I grew up with a very anxious attachment style where everything was very insecure. I needed constant reassurance that was not present. There was no reassurance that was present for me. I never knew if she was going to be around. I never knew if what was going to happen with me, where I was going to end up, or, any of that. I never knew if she was going to become so volatile that she chased me through the room with the belt. There were just all these things that were so far outside of my control that I grew up with this very anxious attachment style that has woven itself into the way that I show up in the world today, even. And, so if I, experience even the perceived threat of abandonment, or the perceived threat of rejection, or the perceived threat of letting someone down in some capacity, then
Mhm.
immediately my anxiety skyrockets and I start spinning my wheels of what can I do to fix this? Like, I have to do something to fix this. And so much of that, up until recent years has been rooted in people pleasing and, going above and beyond for people, spending resources that I didn't really have to spend to appease and accommodate other people because I needed to feel that I had something to keep them
And
around.
to fit in.
Yes, yes, exactly, exactly. And then, on the flip side of that, we also have avoidant attachment,
I was
which is
going to
very
say, what other styles are there? There's so avoidance. How does that show up?
so avoidant people, and I have moments where I experience this as well. Avoidant people, once things start moving close, they need their space. They start to withdraw. And, when I've been in situations before where things are going well, whether it's, jobs that I've been at historically, or, even friendships, or, dating, or what have you, when things have been going well, then I withdraw because I don't trust it. Now, I'm not in that space now. I have done a lot of reflection on that, a lot of healing work, that has positioned me differently, and to recognize when I do have that tendency to start to
Right.
withdraw. And it's common for people to have one much stronger attachment style than the other. The anxious attachment is certainly the most um, prominent one for me. But again, in certain situations that, avoidant, like I don't have time to deal with this. So I'm going to keep myself really busy with work. I'm going to keep myself really busy with advocacy, right? Dare I say, um, to avoid having to truly get close,
Mm-hmm.
not even just to other people, but through that closeness with other people, getting close to myself. I think that has been the ultimate fear, is getting close to myself and my own woundedness, because then I have to face
Why, for me, I know the pandemic was very, very difficult for
it.
many people,
Right.
especially those who were living in an abusive situation,
Hmm.
relationship, family, friends, whatever it might have been. But I know for me, a fear of being alone or being still or being quiet
Right.
is always something I tried to avoid. I was always going, 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 doing, doing, doing.
Hmm.
And the pandemic allowed me to
Yeah.
decompress. But
Right.
then it was like, what do I do?
Yeah.
Like, what do I do with myself all these hours? And at the time, my financial situation from the relationship hadn't caught up. So then there was the added pandemic issues with financial. And it
Yes.
was like, okay, so the cable is off. Okay. Can't really go anywhere, can't really do anything, can't really spend money, don't have any money to spend anyway.
Hmm.
Um, what do I do to occupy my time with just me?
Hmm.
And no TV, no outside influences. Mind you, it probably did create a bit of a uh, an attachment to the phone because that was my only source of entertainment. But
Right.
I realized how much I connected with my dog, how much
Hmm.
I was able to just breathe and rest and enjoy a cup of coffee without the constant in my ear, and the voices that were constantly negative,
Hmm.
including my own inner dialogue. They quieted.
Right.
And so being still was a really hard thing for me for years and years and years. And
Oh yeah.
now it's like, do we really need to go?
Hmm.
Like
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
fine to stay home and just do my own thing,
Right.
um, and not worry about the outside world.
Right.
I mean, I have a job to pay the bills, and I have things that feel my passion, but it's
Hmm.
like they don't really need to be outside the door, do they? you
Right.
know,
Yeah. Exactly.
and it's been a good thing actually
Yeah.
to be comfortable with myself because I really do think for a long time I was
Absolutely.
never.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think, for me, I can relate in the sense that I feel like I have landed at the space in my life now where I am content in achieving the objectives that I have to achieve without overachieving, right?
Mhm.
So I set goals for myself, but they're not so astronomical that I feel like I am bleeding myself dry, and that I feel like I'm constantly in this fight or flight state about the risk of failure. Because that was the other thing. I felt
Mm,
like I was positioning myself with these very unrealistic expectations for myself.
mhm.
And the fact that big things kept happening very quickly and just back to back to back, it was like there was always this adrenaline rush where I was, chasing that next win, but also in that fight or flight state of what if I fail? What if I fail? And that was part of the addiction to that thought process from when I was a kid, because I always, felt like I was going to fail.
Mm-hmm.
So, being able to sit now and say, I'm content with where I am. I'm content. I want to be successful. I make decisions in my life that, position me to be successful. But my definition of success now is much more laid back than it was in
Mm-hmm.
previous years. I
Yeah.
am okay with things just going well. They don't have to go perfectly. They don't have to,
So a
come with,
messy desk and some
yeah,
things left at the office to do the next day
yeah,
is okay. There
it's
was a
okay.
time when like the desk had to look as though
Mm-hmm.
everything was done,
Mm-hmm.
everything was great. I could stay at work till midnight and
Yes.
at 12:05 be at home and think there was something else I could have done.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'd get in the car and go back. And it was
Yeah.
like, what are you doing? No one
Oh,
cares that you're here at midnight getting it
yeah.
done except for you. And it's
Absolutely.
like, no, now I can leave the job at the job and
Right.
leave the desk a little bit messy and not worry about someone will find out. Again, that's that imposter syndrome, which is not something I've completely like researched and understand, but that phrase imposter, it's almost like you're waiting to be found out that you're not
Mm-hmm.
who you say you are. And
Exactly. Because you're not perfect. Yeah. Because we don't extend grace to ourselves. If we didn't have grace
right,
extended to us growing up, because we were exposed to narcissistic abuse, then we don't give ourselves grace unless we
right,
reach that place where we're very mindful of it.
right.
And I mean, I'm right there with you, because again, I finally have reached the place where things don't have to be perfect. I don't have to promote this facade of being perfect in some way. Right down to, I'll tell you, as you can see, because I know you can see me, Tina, the lighting where I am right now, it's not the greatest. I got this big shadow going across me and stuff, and that's fine. And I did this intentionally because when I used to do interviews and when I used to show up on podcasts before, I would have my makeup done, my hair was done. I set up the ring light. Yes, I have a ring light that I intentionally bought for that because I wanted to appear that I had it all together. I had to appear
Mhm.
perfect in order to feel like anyone was going to take me seriously. And what I've
That's
realized
yeah.
is that that is so inauthentic for the core of who I am. Y'all are going to see me with, hair that hasn't been washed for 3 days. So that's why I have it pulled back. You're going to see me with, I'm sure my makeup at this point is kind of smeared because it's the end of the day. And I don't have great lighting. But you know what? This is real life. And I would much rather show up in the world as someone that is truly relatable to other people than to build out this facade that people can't really relate to. And then there's not that connectedness. I want that meaningful connectedness, that authentic connectedness is what I truly believe propels us towards healing.
Well, and that's
And
something that separates us from abusers because
yeah.
abusers want to appear perfect, but
Hmm.
they are a chameleon in that they present themselves this way at one point in time and this way at another point in time or with a different group of people.
Right.
And I can remember early on thinking to myself, why is he working so hard to be so different from who he is in front of this group of people or this group of people? Like I'm Christian and I cuss. I,
Hmm.
I drink coffee and I drink other stuff. It's like, why do people, it's like, well, if I'm with the church people, I have to be this way. And if I'm over here, I have to be this way. And I used to say to him all the time, online, offline, friends, work, family, strangers,
Hmm.
shouldn't it all be the same? Like, why are you playing this game? Well, I
Yeah.
figured it out. But, showing up in the world with our wounds
Hmm.
and allowing them to be shown is different than showing up with trauma that's unhealed.
Right.
And I don't think we see that difference very easily. I think we think that if people see our trauma, they will judge us. So we hide the trauma. but we can't hide the wounds. And so they
Right.
see it anyway when you show those, and they don't have an understanding for, well, why is she so upset at this moment but not
Right.
this moment? It's because we've not explained to anyone who
Mm-hmm.
we are. But
Mm-hmm.
that's where Survivor's Corner, I know, helped me, because it was like, but I don't have to tell everything
Mm-hmm.
all the time, all at once, to everyone. There
Right.
are some things that I still haven't shared that are really difficult. You know, and so, like I said, showing your wounds and that you're human is
Mm-hmm.
not the same as showing up with unhealed trauma and inflicting it upon everyone else.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, and I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Boundaries within that is definitely important. And I think it's okay for us to show up in the world with our wounds exposed as long as we are keeping those boundaries for ourselves. We absolutely have the right to limit what we share. We have the right to decide what we're going to share in those safe spaces. Excuse me. Um, and I also think that it's important that, again, we are reflective of our why. Why is it important that we're doing the work that we're doing, whether that's publicly or, within our intimate circles or what have you. Because that why helps us to know ourselves so much better. And I think that self knowledge truly is the root of, getting that better foundation within ourselves where we can start accepting our own worthiness and our own lovability. And that has definitely that's been where I have truly been spending probably the past year of my life, is in really trying to embody my lovability. And when I have those defeating thoughts pop up that tell me that I'm not right for whatever reason, I
Mm-hmm.
have to recognize them, not judge them, not get angry with those parts of myself, but be very mindful about creating space, allowing space for those insecure moments to happen and loving myself through it. And associating myself with people that can also love me through those times.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So now, where will your advocacy work take you next, do you think? At a different scale or a different level, but what do you think it will look like next?
So I've been working on my memoir for the past several years, and I'm getting to the point I've been really reflecting over the past several months about moving forward with publishing. And so once I do that, getting that out there, being able to share so many more details,
Mm-hmm.
including this past year's journey of reflection, right?
Right.
Including that, that's going to really launch me forward with the advocacy, and it's going to be at a much smaller scale than what I did before. And I'm all for being public with my story, but not to the point where it depletes me like it did previously.
Right.
So I
Right.
want to share my story in the form of a book. I want to set a reasonable number of, public appearances, interviews, what have you. And, at that point, begin proceeding forward with whatever the next chapter naturally and organically unfolds as. But I have lost the need to set, these very high bars for myself to achieve. And I've gotten to the place where I really am just willing and open to receive what's in the moment for me to seize.
Mm-hmm. My high bar is sometimes I get out of bed, I get a cup of coffee, and you know what? I don't have to go anywhere or
Hmm.
do anything or
Yeah.
see anyone, and you know what? It's okay.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Exactly.
It's okay. Well, I know that we are coming up on 8 o'clock. I know that my next guest is going to be just a little bit late. I wanted to give you a chance. We're going to take a little bit of an intermission, but I did want to give you a chance. Do you have any final words or thoughts for anyone out there who's watching, who's just overwhelmed or insecure
Hmm.
or uncertain. Perhaps they're living in an abusive situation and they haven't figured out yet how to move out of it.
Right.
Maybe they're out of it and they don't know what comes next. Because I know for me, my biggest challenge has been I'm 58 and this is not where I thought I would be.
Right. Right. Right.
And
Understood.
fighting that
Understood.
daily.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I'll be 59 on Sunday, so we won't talk about that. But that's been my biggest challenge.
Yeah.
Is what does the rest of my life look like when I thought I had it all figured out? So,
Right.
what are some of your final thoughts in that regard, Donna?
That's a really great question as well. I think, and again, just reflecting my own personal experience of what I've really been coming to myself over this past year is that whatever state we're in is temporary. There is no true permanence to anything. Change is the one thing that we can
Change is
count on in
permanent.
life.
Change
Yeah,
is the one thing that's
it
always
is.
permanent.
Exactly. It's the one thing that we can count on in life. And, the beauty of that is we get to decide what that change is going to look like.
Mhm.
And we get to decide how that change is going to happen within, because as we start doing that inner work of change within, that's when we start to see our external circumstances begin to change.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
almost like we start calling forth opportunities to ourselves that are more in alignment with that interchange that we are creating.
Mhm.
The other thing that I would say, and this is just going back to what we, talked about a moment ago, is allow yourself grace, because you don't have to be perfect. And, regardless of if you are a trauma survivor, if you're loving a trauma survivor, and, you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to be perfect. It is plenty okay to show up in the world as a messy individual that has, 77 layers of complexity to you. Because at the end of the day, we're all there. We all have our life stories, and we all have stories that build upon stories.
Just like I was just laughing and thinking, I can remember, other people saying, well, yesterday that didn't upset you. Why does it upset you today? And it's like,
Yeah.
well, I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
And
It's
part of it
a
is because yesterday it was the only thing that upset me, but today is the 10th thing that has upset
right.
me. And so
Yeah.
now it seems like a much bigger deal.
Yeah.
I do. I think that one thing I said a few weeks ago on the podcast, I was talking to a woman in the United Kingdom and talking to someone here in the United States, and then we were talking about the systems and the abuse within systems.
Absolutely.
Um, the educational, political, but in particular, we were talking about the judicial, and we were talking about the only perfect victim is the one pretending to be a victim
Yeah.
because everything is just perfect. It's like all the story fits together.
Yeah.
But for those of us who are truly victims, it's messy. We
Yeah.
cry, it's an ugly cry. We scream, it's an ugly scream. We say things we don't mean. We hurt,
Right.
and we're not a perfect victim
Yeah.
because it's messy. The perfect
Exactly.
victim is the one pretending to be a victim.
Right.
And I think
Exactly.
we need to keep those two things very separate from each other. I want to thank you. For those who are watching on TikTok, um, this is Love Over Coffee, Voices Not Heard. It's a podcast and a platform for the marginalized, the silenced, and the abused. We're going to take a short break. Um, I guess I will probably turn off TikTok Live and then come right back. On my screen, I'm going to play like an intermission video that used to play at the drive-in
Nice.
when I was a kid. So it's about
Thank
a
you
10
so
minute
much, Tina.
intermission. So, well, thank you because you were definitely a part of my healing journey. And
Thank you.
yet, I do understand when you move beyond and out of levels of healing. And
Yeah.
some things that you needed initially are not things you need as much now. So I
Exactly.
get that. I get that. The podcast, it is something I'm very proud of for 2 years, but we've also grown into some other areas as well. And
Right.
I realized that the 9 to 5 job pays the bills, but there's a lot of things that feed my and fuel my passion, and
Right.
those are the things that I'm glad I have the energy and the time to do now. I
Absolutely.
wouldn't have had with the job that I had before, which was working 8 a.m. till midnight and then going
Yeah,
home to worry about it until 8 a.m. the next morning. So,
exactly. Exactly.
um, so I am not going to end the podcast, but I am going to hopefully share the screen with the intermission video. Hopefully, we'll see if we
Thank
can
you,
figure this
Tina.
out. Thank you so much. So Donna, I'm gonna move you out of the screen. Um, so you won't be able to. So you're. I know you're gonna leave and disconnect and all that. So I'm gonna remove you from the stream. So
All
thank you
right.
so
Thank
much.
you. Take
You're
care. I'll talk
welcome.
to you
Thank
soon,
you.
I'm sure.
Bye.
Bye.
All right. And now I am going to play the video. Hopefully. Hopefully. Do you hear? Well, there we go. It's one of those ones where the hot dog used to jump in the bun. I mean, just hilarious. So anyway, I just want to say again, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for listening in. I really hope that many of you are gaining some understanding. If it is not your own trauma that you are dealing with, but maybe you love someone, as she mentioned, someone who is a trauma victim and survivor, someone who's still figuring out and processing their own trauma, that you are loving without judgment, and that you are encouraging them to be the best that they can be. And that means that sometimes they show up and sometimes they don't. As I have said before, many times it is difficult to show up for others when you cannot show up for yourself. But I hope that at some point that mind shift happens. And that is a difficult mind shift. But in order for true healing to occur, that mind shift has to happen. And I just wanted to say again, I want to thank everyone for being here. Your loves and your likes and your shares, your gifting, it all matters. As I have said, I am a words of affirmation love language person, and I am also quality time person. So those two things feed my soul. And of course, teaching others, helping others, that's part of the quality time, is that we spend time together actually doing something rather important. Um, and what that can look like might vary, but it's one of the reasons why I love TikTok, because it gives me a chance to interact and help others, which is part of my people pleasing, which I doubt very seriously is ever going to go away. Um, I'm just being sure who it is I'm trying to please, myself more than the other individual, but also pleasing is often a boundary set as well. So I do want to remind you, I have a subscription box series called Love Over Coffee, Reclaiming Self. And I know that you might not have been able to hear, but I wanted to share once again. This is in the subscription box coming up. The box is focused on self love, self care, healing trauma. This particular box is about going back to your childhood and healing that inner child. So I wanted to read to you again. It's a school bus going back in time, but it's also a school bus with permission slips. And here are the permissions that you have. So it says, I give myself permission to set limits and say no. I give myself permission to stop and take a break. I give myself permission to listen to what I need. I give myself permission to not be perfect. I give myself permission to be present. And I give myself permission to accept help from others. So this month's box is going out next week. If it is something you are interested in, there are only about 3 more boxes. And the link is in my bio on TikTok. And also, I have a Discord server now where I'm like trying to track everything at the same time. Of course, I have the Real Change page on Facebook. I have a VIP group for some various things. I have a Real Change Facebook group. I have an 1111 Facebook group, and of course, I also have a YouTube channel. So if you like me here, go like me in one of the other places. It helps with the algorithm. And of course, I would like to get the Real Change business page on Facebook up to 1,000, but it is a work in progress, as am I. So thank you again for coming. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to Karen and to I saw Gina over here, and thank you to Shirley and to Pat. Thank you to Lynn. I really appreciate all of you being here. And of course, again, thank you on TikTok. Tomorrow night, Karen, Patricia Jones, and I are going to talk about, and hopefully keep you giggling, life after 50. What does it look like to be starting over after 50 and after abuse? It can be quite the funny ride. So, tomorrow night, get ready for some giggles and some laughs. And we will probably share some of the most comical moments that sometimes we find humor in now that we certainly didn't find, back then, because things were so crazy. But thank you again to my moderators, Sue, Cat Links, Angel, and Pink, otherwise known as Nicole. And Cat is Lori, so I apologize. I usually give their username. If you're not following and you decided to hang out, please follow. Hit the notifications. Tomorrow night we'll be back at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Have a great night. Thank you, Sue, for being here. Thank you, Nicole. I really appreciate it. Thank you, guys. We didn't get many gifts tonight, and I keep forgetting to announce that TikTok is choosing the goal, and I'm so confused. And I am busy watching the podcast as well. It's one of those things where as you watch and you listen, you sometimes hear things the second time that you didn't hear the first time, or maybe you've come a longer way and and you're hearing it a little bit differently. So it's interesting to go back and listen to some of the rebroadcasts. She was basically married off at 16, and my own grandmother was. She did not get married until she was 19, but she met the guy she was going to marry when she was 9. And he even looked at her and said, he was 10 years older. He looked at her and said, you would make someone a good wife, and I'm going to be the husband. And she was 9 and he was 19. Doesn't it make you wonder? We know of people out there who got married at 13 and 14. I grew up with someone who was 13. I know someone else who was 14. I know someone else who was 16. Parents signing away rights to very young children to get married. Um, Loretta Lynn is someone who got married very young. Um, you know, Child marriage is still legal in some states. One of the things that Donna's been instrumental in is working to change policy in Washington. I know one of her most recent states was North Carolina. They still allowed parents to sign and let girls get married at, well, and boys too, I guess. But again, it's predominantly women who get married very young. And so sometimes the abuser is 19, 20, and the young girl is 14 and 15, not able to make that decision. But then parents will help make that decision for them, which is crazy for me to think about. But a long time ago, you didn't even need permission. It was crazy. So that's a lot of what her platform has been, is child marriage, um, because she was married off at 16. So love all you guys. Thank you so much again for joining us at Love Over Coffee, Voices Now Heard for the marginalized, the silenced, and the abused. And tomorrow night is night 23 of 31 to bring awareness to the issue of domestic violence in October, which is the month for October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So thanks, everybody. I'm going to say goodnight to TikTok first. I'm going to say goodnight to all you guys over here as well. I really appreciate your presence. And thank you so much for being here. I'll see you back tomorrow night at 9 p.m. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Peace, love, and light, and go have a cup of coffee.